Lights in the back hallway of my bakery were off, which was strange because Tuesdays were inventory days and my operations manager always came in early. I pulled into the parking lot behind the building at 6:45 in the morning, same as I had for 31 years. The October air in Fredericton had that bite to it, the kind that gets into your knees before it gets into your coat. I was carrying 2 coffees, one for me, one out of habit, because my husband had been gone 4 years and I still made 2 cups every single morning without thinking. The delivery driver from Acadian Foods was already there, stacking flour bags on the dolly near the back door. I'd known him for maybe 3 years. Quiet man, always polite, always on time. He looked up when he heard my boots on the pavement, and something in his face made me slow down. He set the bag down, walked toward me, and then he lowered his voice in a way that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "don't go in the front yet. I think—" He stopped, looked back at the door. I was just inside dropping the first load and I heard something you should know about. Your manager, the tall one. He was on the phone and he didn't hear me come in. He paused. "I think you need to use the side entrance, and I think you need to listen before you let on that you're here." I stood there holding 2 coffees in the cold, and I looked at this man, this quiet, reliable man who had never once in 3 years said anything to me beyond good morning and have a good one. And I made a decision in about 4 seconds. I handed him one of the coffees. I went around to the side. "I want to tell you something about Cedric before I tell you the rest of this story, because none of what happened will make sense unless you understand who I thought he was. I hired Cedric 11 years ago when my daughter was pregnant with her first, and I was starting to think, for the first time in 3 decades, that maybe I couldn't do everything alone anymore. My husband, Alistair, had been my partner in the business, and when he had his first heart attack, I started handling the operations side myself. When he passed, I just kept going. You do. You keep going because the alternative is standing still, and standing still felt like giving up something that belonged to both of us. Cedric came with a solid resume and 2 good references from bakeries in Moncton. He was organized. He was calm. He knew the supply chain, and he understood margins in a way that took me years to learn myself. Within 8 months, I'd given him full signing authority on vendor accounts. Within 2 years, I'd handed him the scheduling, the staffing, the ordering, everything except the recipes and the customer relationships, which I kept because those were mine and always would be. My daughter thought I was too trusting. She'd say it gently, the way she says most things. "Mom, you don't have to give him everything. You can trust someone and still keep your hands on it." I'd tell her I was fine. I'd tell her Cedric had never given me a reason. I believed that right up until I pressed myself against the cold brick wall of my own bakery and listened to him sell it. He was in the prep kitchen. I could hear him clearly through the pass-through window I'd left cracked open the summer before to let out steam and never got around to closing properly. He was talking to someone on the phone, and his voice had a different quality to it. Lower, yes, but also looser. The way a person talks when they think no one who matters is listening. "The valuation came back at 810, he said, which is actually on the low side, given the real volume, but I've been running the numbers through the secondary accounts, so the official books read lower. If she ever gets them audited, which she won't, because she trusts me, the discrepancy is explainable." A pause. "No, she doesn't know. She doesn't look at the vendor invoices anymore. That's been true for about 4 years. I didn't breathe. The Maplewood Group wants to move by November the 15th. That gives us about 3 weeks. If I can get her to sign the management transfer as part of the expansion discussion, she thinks we're talking about opening a second location. Then legally the operating control shifts before she realizes what the structure actually means." Another pause. Shorter this time. "Yes. The new location in Dieppe was never real. It was just a reason to get the restructuring documents drafted." I stood in that hallway for what felt like a very long time. The flour on the floor near the doorway had been there since the morning delivery, and I stared at it. I could smell the bread from the ovens. I had been making bread in this building since I was 34 years old. 31 years. I thought about Alistair. About the first year, when we had one display case and a folding table, and we sold out every Saturday by 10 in the morning and thought that was the best thing that had ever happened to us. Then I walked back outside, got in my car, and called my daughter. She answered on the second ring. She always answers on the second ring. Her words are that the first ring is for breathing and the second ring is for picking up. I don't know where she got that from. Not from me. I told her everything, all of it in order, from the delivery driver to the secondary account to the Maplewood Group to the date of November 15th. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long have you been standing in the parking lot?" "About 12 minutes. "Okay," she said. "Don't go back in. I'm calling Warren." Warren was her husband, my son-in-law. I need to stop here for a moment and be honest about something, because this part matters. I had not always been easy on my son-in-law. Not unkind, no, but reserved. He worked in commercial real estate law, and I had always found his profession a little abstract. I am a woman who has measured a good day in loaves sold, and I had a hard time understanding a job where nothing you do results in something you can hold. I think, though I'd never have admitted it at the time, that I also resented slightly that my daughter had chosen someone so different from her father. Alistair built things with his hands before we opened the bakery. My son-in-law did not own a single tool that required physical effort. I had never once thought to ask him for help. He called me back in 4 minutes. "I'm going to ask you some questions," he said, "and I need you to answer them exactly as you remember. Don't interpret, don't summarize. Just tell me what you heard, word for word if you can." I told him, word for word. He asked me 3 follow-up questions about the vendor accounts and the secondary accounts Cedric had mentioned. Then he said, "Okay, I need you to do something that is going to feel completely wrong. I need you to go back inside, act completely normal, and tell Cedric you want to schedule a sit-down this week about the Dieppe expansion. Can you do that?" "Why?" "Because if he thinks you're still in the dark, he'll keep operating as normal and we can document everything. The moment he knows you know, the accounts go cold and the paper trail disappears." He paused. "And because right now what you have is what you heard. We need what he did." I sat in that car. I looked at my bakery, the sign my husband and I had painted ourselves in 1993, dark green letters, cream background, the little sheaf of wheat in the corner that our daughter had drawn when she was 9 years old, and that we'd thought was so charming we'd actually used it and never changed it. "Okay," I said, "I can do that." I went inside. I made it past the prep kitchen, past Cedric, said good morning, told him I wanted to find a time to talk about Dieppe because I was feeling energized about the second location and wanted to get moving. He smiled. He said, "That's great, Rosemary. I'll put something in the calendar for Thursday." He called me Rosemary. He'd called me that for 11 years. I had told him early on that Mrs. Whitmore felt stiff and that Rosemary was fine. I smiled back. I went into my office. I closed the door and I sat at my desk and I did not move for approximately 45 seconds while I waited for my hands to stop shaking. Then I opened my laptop, pulled up the vendor account portal, the one I hadn't looked at in close to 2 years because I had trusted him, and I started reading. By noon I had found 3 discrepancies. By 2 in the afternoon I had found 9. My son-in-law arrived at the bakery at 4:30 with a colleague from his firm, a woman who specialized in commercial fraud. She was younger than I expected, matter-of-fact in the way that good lawyers often are, and she shook my hand once and got directly to the point. "We have enough to initiate," she said, "but I want to move carefully because the Maplewood connection suggests this isn't just Cedric acting alone. If there's a buyer who knew the books were being manipulated to lower the valuation, that's a separate exposure." She looked at my son-in-law. 72 hours. 72 hours, he said. I found out later that this was a phrase they use for a specific kind of tight window documentation process, pulling records, freezing account access, and filing a preservation order before anyone on the other side had reason to think anything had changed. In my world, 72 hours meant 3 days of baking. In theirs, it apparently meant the difference between recovering something and losing it entirely. I went home that night and made supper. I don't know why that detail feels important to tell you, but it does. I made a pot of chicken and barley soup because the weather had turned and because making soup is something I can do without thinking, and I needed to do something without thinking. I set the table. I sat alone. I ate, which surprised me. Then I called my daughter to say goodnight, and she said, "How are you holding up?" And I said, "I don't know yet." She said that was an honest answer. The next 3 days were some of the strangest of my life. I continued to come in every morning at 6:45. I continued to make small talk. I sat in the Thursday meeting with Cedric and listened to him walk me through the Dieppe expansion timeline, a completely fabricated document I now understood, designed to inch me toward signing a management transfer I would not have read closely enough. And I asked questions and nodded and said things like, "That sounds reasonable, and let me think about that," while sitting on information that would dismantle everything he was describing. I am not a confrontational person by nature. I grew up in a household where my mother handled difficulty by outlasting it. You didn't argue, you didn't escalate, you waited. Alistair used to say that was both my greatest strength and my most maddening quality. Sitting in that meeting, I thought he was right on both counts. On the second day, my son-in-law called to tell me they pulled the Maplewood communications through the commercial chain and found emails that predated Cedric's hire by 8 months. 8 months before I hired him. He had come to me with references. He had come to me knowing the valuation timeline he was working toward. The position he'd applied for, the exact one I was looking for at exactly the right moment, had been identified as a point of entry. My grief, my exhaustion, my need for someone to trust, all of that had been mapped before he ever walked through my door. I sat down on the stairs in my kitchen when my son-in-law told me this. I just sat down right on the third step, and I didn't say anything for a long time. "Rosemary," my son-in-law said, "I know what you're thinking. Don't." How do you not? Because he was professional for 11 years, because he was careful, because you were not naive, you were deceived, and those are not the same thing. His voice was firm and oddly gentle at the same time. "I need you to hear that." I heard it. I'm not sure I believed it fully in that moment, but I heard it. On the morning of day 3, my daughter came to the bakery before opening. She walked into my office and she closed the door, and she sat across from me and she put a bag of butter tarts on my desk from the bakery 2 streets over, my favorite, and not from my own shop, which is the kind of thing she does that reminds me she knows me better than I know myself sometimes. "I have to tell you something," she said. I looked at her. "I went to see Cedric yesterday, at his apartment. I know you didn't ask me to, and I know Warren would have a complete fit, so I'm telling you now before it becomes relevant." She folded her hands. "I needed to see if he'd say anything to me." "And?" "He didn't know that I knew anything. He was friendly, normal. He asked how the kids were." She paused. "And then I asked him, very casually, whether he thought the Dieppe location was realistic given the interest rate environment, and whether a single location restructuring might actually make more sense. Just to see." "What did he say?" "He said he thought the restructuring was the smarter play and that he'd been thinking about it for a while." She looked at me steadily. "He volunteered it. Mum, he was going to pitch you the restructuring himself if the Dieppe meeting hadn't moved fast enough. He had a whole secondary plan." I looked at the butter tarts. I looked at my daughter. She had driven across the city alone, sat in front of a man who had spent 11 years deceiving her mother, and extracted a usable piece of information that my son-in-law later confirmed could be documented through Cedric's phone records as consistent with a separate communication channel they'd already flagged. She was 41 years old. She had been telling me gently for years to keep my hands on the wheel. "Your father would have liked Warren," I said. "It came out before I thought it." She blinked, then she smiled. "Just a little." "Yeah," she said, "he would have." The RCMP were involved by Friday morning, which is faster than I would have imagined such things could move and slower than it felt from the inside. The commercial fraud file was taken up by an investigator out of Fredericton, who was, in his own way, as matter of fact as my son-in-law's colleague had been. He sat across from me in my office, the same chair Cedric had sat in for 11 years of Thursday meetings, and he walked me through what they had. The secondary vendor account had been drawing a consistent percentage off invoices for 4 years, total over the period a little over $47,000. The Maplewood Group, a private acquisition firm operating primarily in Atlantic Canada, had been in communication with Cedric for 8 months before his hire and had reconnected approximately 14 months ago, which aligned with a shift in the invoice pattern that the investigator described as a transition from passive skimming to active positioning. Passive skimming. That phrase has stayed with me, as though money leaving my business had a personality, as though it moved slowly so as not to startle anyone. Cedric was arrested on a Thursday, not a Tuesday, which I had always thought of as his best day. The Maplewood Group's principals are subject to a separate proceeding that I have been told will take considerably longer to resolve. My lawyer, the young, matter-of-fact one, has advised me not to discuss the details. I am following her advice. What I can tell you is that I did not sign the management transfer. I did not sign anything I did not understand, because my son-in-law read everything in those final 72 hours, and anything that looked unfamiliar he flagged before it reached my desk. 3 documents had been placed in my signing folder that had no business being there. 2 of them I might have signed without question on an ordinary Thursday morning. I keep that fact somewhere close, not to punish myself, just to keep it close. The delivery driver's name is Keith. I looked it up in the Acadian account file. He's been on the same route for 6 years. I called the company the week after everything came to a head and asked to leave a note for him because I didn't have his direct number and I wasn't sure of the protocol. A few days later, he called me back. I thanked him. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I wasn't sure if I should say anything. It wasn't my business." He paused. "But you always ask how my kids are, and you remember their names." I thought, "I don't know. I thought you deserved to know." He remembered that I asked about his kids. Alistair used to say, "The kindness you put out doesn't always come back in the form you gave it. Sometimes it comes back in forms you can't predict." He was a man who said things like that without any sense that he was being philosophical. He was just telling you what he'd observed. I have thought about that a lot since October. There's something I haven't told you yet, and I want to tell it plainly because it's the part of this story that is hardest and maybe most important. After everything was over, after the arrest, after the file was filed, after my son-in-law and I sat at my kitchen table going through the restructured operations plan and figuring out what the next 2 years would look like, I asked myself how I had let it go so far. And the answer, honestly, is that I confused loyalty with abdication. I trusted Cedric, and that trust was real. It was not a mistake that I trusted someone who presented himself as trustworthy. The mistake was that I mistook giving him responsibility for giving him oversight of myself. I stopped asking questions not because I believed there was nothing to ask, but because asking felt like it undermined the relationship, like checking up on him was an insult to the trust I'd extended. But trust isn't a thing you give once and then stop tending. That's what I understand now. It's not a closed account. It has to stay open. You have to keep looking. My daughter understood this before I did. She never stopped watching, not from suspicion, but from care. She was watching for me the way I'd watched for her when she was small, the way good attention doesn't feel like surveillance because it's coming from love and not from fear. I had been so focused on not becoming someone who micromanaged, someone who couldn't let go, that I went too far in the other direction and let go of too much. I'm 63 years old. I have run a business in this city for 31 years. I know how to read a balance sheet, and I know how to manage staff, and I know how flour behaves in humidity, and how to tell when a relationship with a supplier is going sideways before anyone has said a word. I let someone convince me, slowly and carefully, that I was tired enough to need someone else to do my seeing for me. I was not that tired. I am not that tired. The bakery had its 31st anniversary the last weekend of November. I had thought about doing something low-key. My daughter thought otherwise, and she was right, which is something I am getting better at acknowledging in reasonable time, rather than in hindsight only. We had a line out the door on the Saturday, local people, some of whom had been coming since before my daughter was born, some of whom had come in for the first time that morning because someone told them about the anniversary. Keith from Acadian came with his wife and his youngest, who is 7, and chose a maple cream cookie and then asked with complete seriousness whether he could have another one. I told him he could have 2. My son-in-law was there. He stood near the back, a little out of the way he does in spaces that aren't his. I went over to him at one point, and I said, "I want you to know that I have not adequately recognized what you did." I said it simply and I meant it completely. He looked a little uncomfortable, which is how I know he is genuinely a good person, because good people are always slightly uncomfortable being thanked. He said he would have figured it out. I said, "Maybe, but not in 72 hours. He nodded. Then he said, "Alastair built this place." I said, "He did. And you kept it." I looked around, the display cases, the sheaf of wheat my daughter drew when she was 9, the smell of bread that has been in this building for 3 decades and is, by now, probably in the walls. "I kept it," I said. "I kept all of it. The legacy and the lesson, the loss and what came after, the bread and the names of the delivery driver's children, and the knowledge that the kindness you put into the world has a way of finding you again when you need it most. I kept it. And I am not done yet. I've been thinking about Keith a lot lately, not about what he said exactly, but about the fact that he almost didn't say it. He told me himself it wasn't his business. He stood there with a dolly full of flour bags in the cold, and he made a choice that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with the kind of person he'd decided to be. That's the thing about decency. It doesn't announce itself ahead of time. It just shows up on a Tuesday morning and changes everything. What Cedric did was patient and deliberate. 11 years is a long time to maintain a performance, and I don't say that to minimize the betrayal. I say it because I think it matters to name what it actually was. It wasn't a moment of weakness or a bad decision made under pressure. It was a sustained choice, made over and over again, to take from someone who had trusted him. Every morning he came in and smiled and called me Rosemary. He was making that choice again. I used to think that was the hardest part to sit with. Now I think the harder part is understanding that his capacity for that kind of dishonesty had nothing to do with me. And the fact that I didn't see it wasn't a failure of my intelligence, it was a consequence of his. My daughter has a quality I didn't fully appreciate until this year. She watches. She doesn't hover, she doesn't interfere, but she watches, quietly, consistently, from a place of love rather than suspicion, and she acts when it matters. She drove across the city alone to sit with a man who had been deceiving her mother for over a decade, and she stayed calm enough to draw out information my son-in-law could actually use. That took clarity. It took nerve. And it took the kind of steady, patient courage that doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but holds everything together from the inside. I think about what I'd say to a younger version of myself, the woman who opened that bakery at 34 with Alastair and a single display case and more hope than sense. I'd tell her that trust is not a transaction you complete once and file away. It's something you tend. You can give someone real responsibility and still ask questions. You can believe in someone and still read the invoices. Those things don't contradict each other. Oversight isn't suspicion, it's stewardship. And the business, the legacy, the 31 years of flour and early mornings and the smell that's worked its way into the walls that deserves to be stewarded. What I know now is that I had everything I needed to protect what I'd built. The instincts were there, the people who loved me were there, I just needed to stay present enough to use them. Grief has a way of making you feel like checking out is the same as coping, and it isn't. You can carry the loss and still keep your eyes open. You can honor someone who is gone by refusing to let go of what the two of you built together. Keith asked about his kids because ask about his kids. That circle closed when I needed it most. I don't think that's coincidence. I think that's just how it works. The care you extend, the honesty you practice, the willingness to stay upright when it would be easier not to. It accumulates. It builds something. And sometimes, when someone is standing in a parking lot in Fredericton at 6:45 in the morning, not knowing what is about to happen to her, it comes back.